Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the, let's call it political theology of one of Silicon Valley's most powerful and frankly most mysterious figures, Peter Thiel. We're going to try and figure out why a man who literally helped build our digital future is now suddenly obsessed with a villain from the biblical past, the Antichrist.
So here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at Thiel's really strange world tour. Then, we'll unpack the whole history of using the Antichrist as a political weapon. After that, we'll get into the pretty dark ideas that are driving his thinking and expose a massive contradiction at the heart of his work. And then finally, we'll get to why any of this actually matters to you and me.
All right, so let's start with the central mystery here. Peter Thiel's recent and very weird world tour.
And look, this is not just some casual hobby. I'm talking about a series of very secretive, closed-door lectures he's been giving at some of the most elite places on Earth. Oxford, Harvard, a gathering of Catholic theologians. And the topic is always the same, which is just bizarre. It's always about the Antichrist.
And just so we're clear, he is not speaking in metaphors here. Thiel has explicitly named his political opponents, like climate activist Greta Thunberg, as a possible Antichrist. And this is exactly where abstract theology stops being theology and starts being a political weapon. You're not just disagreeing with someone anymore. You're turning them into a symbol of pure, cosmic evil.
Now, to really get what Thiel is doing, you have to understand that he's not the first person to do this, not by a long shot. This tactic of naming the Antichrist is actually part of a very old and very effective political playbook.
So here's the funny thing. According to historian Dr. Robert Fuller, this popular image we have of the Antichrist as some kind of world-ending supervillain, it's a huge exaggeration. If you actually look at the Bible, the word is barely in there. It just refers to dissenters inside the early church community. It was only much, much later that this idea got mashed up with the way more dramatic figure of the beast from Revelation.
And you can see this pattern all throughout American history. The Antichrist label has basically been a tool to demonize whoever the enemy of the day was. We're talking Native Americans, the British king, even Abraham Lincoln in the South. Then it was the communists, and in our own time, Barack Obama. It's the ultimate way to define your us by creating a truly monstrous them.
And this quote right here, it really gets to the heart of it. The fastest, most effective way to forge a fanatical group identity isn't to give them a god to worship, it's to give them a devil to hate. It creates this intense, unquestioning tribal loyalty.
So, what happens when you use this playbook? Well, the outcome is pretty predictable, and it's dangerous. Once your opponent is literally the Antichrist, compromise is off the table, right? How can you possibly negotiate with pure evil? So it creates this permanent state of crisis that can be used to justify extreme actions. Suddenly, things that would normally seem immoral are reframed as a sacred duty.
Okay, so let's get into the ideology. Because Thiel's worldview is built on some very specific and, let's be honest, deeply controversial philosophical roots that he openly talks about.
So first up is a guy named Carl Schmitt. Schmitt was a legal theorist for the Nazi Party. And for him, politics wasn't about debate or making policies. No, it was about one thing: defining an enemy and then preparing for an existential winner-take-all struggle against them. This is a philosophy that turns politics into total war.
The second major influence was actually Thiel's own professor at Stanford, René Girard. And Girard's big idea was that societies create unity by taking all their internal problems and directing them outward, by uniting against a single scapegoat. It's a really powerful way to control a society, but it's also incredibly brutal.
So why is Thiel so obsessed with these dark ideas about enemies and scapegoats? Well, he uses them to solve a problem that he's constantly talking about, what he calls the stagnation thesis. It's his belief that real progress in technology and society has basically just ground to a halt.
And here is the incredibly cynical connection. If society is stuck, as he says, then it needs a massive jolt to get it moving again. So for Thiel, manufacturing a crisis by defining an enemy, using that Schmitt and Girard playbook, becomes a tool. It's a way to shatter a status quo that he hates and to force the kind of radical change that, conveniently, he and his companies are perfectly positioned to profit from.
This brings us to what might be the most glaring hypocrisy at the absolute heart of Peter Thiel's entire public philosophy.
So on one hand, Thiel goes around acting like a prophet, right? He's warning all of us about this terrifying, one-world, totalitarian state that uses technology to achieve total control.
This is the great evil that he claims to be fighting against.
So what's the problem? Well, his company, Palantir, is one of the world's leading builders of the exact surveillance technology needed for that kind of state. He's out there warning everyone about the danger, while he's getting rich selling the very tools to create it.
I mean, the irony here is so profound it's almost hard to believe. Some critics have even called it a confession. He literally named his global surveillance company after the Palantir, a magical, all-seeing spy globe used by the evil wizard Saruman in The Lord of the Rings. You can't make this stuff up.
So, given all these massive contradictions, you might be wondering, how is Thiel's Antichrist lecture tour being received by, actual experts and theologians? Well, to put it mildly, they are not impressed.
For example, when he presented these ideas to a group of Catholic theologians in Austria, they were deeply critical. They called his ideology unsatisfactory, which is apparently a top-tier insult in academic German, and they said it was a problematic attempt to apply these concepts to real people.
And over in the UK, the conservative paper The Spectator was even more blunt. The writer there called Thiel a poster boy for the sinister global elite that he's always pretending to fight against. The article basically points out that Thiel himself checks almost every box of a classic conspiracy theory villain.
And then back in Thiel's own backyard, Silicon Valley, a local pastor pretty much summed it all up perfectly. He said that this obsessive focus on trying to identify the Antichrist is a fundamentally futile endeavor and a complete distraction from the actual core messages of Christianity.
But look, this is way more than just some billionaire's weird intellectual hobby. This kind of thinking, this framework, has very real, very tangible consequences for our political life.
This whole us versus them ideology, which comes straight from the Nazi theorist Carl Schmitt, is absolutely being put into practice. It's used to justify something called a state of exception. That's a political emergency where you can just suspend normal laws and constitutional rights to fight some existential enemy. So is it any surprise that this exact thinking heavily influences political figures that Thiel has backed, like J.D. Vance, who constantly frame their opponents not as rivals, but as demonic threats to the nation itself?
Ultimately, Thiel's lectures on the Antichrist force us to ask a really serious question. When politics stops being about disagreement and gets reframed as a holy war between good and evil, who gets to decide who the enemy is? And more importantly, what happens to democracy when we stop seeing our opponents as fellow citizens and start seeing them as demons that have to be destroyed?